Welcome back, team, to another APES Screencast. In this screencast, we're going to start Chapter 17 and cover environmental hazards and human health. The chapter begins with a discussion of mercury and its toxic effects on human health. All mercury compounds are considered toxic. Mercury is a neurotoxin that affects nervous system development, and as a result, it has a greater impact on fetuses and children. About 1/3 of mercury in the atmosphere comes from natural sources like volcanoes. The other 2/3 comes from human activities. The graph on this slide shows the different contributions of different human activities on mercury emissions. There are two ways in which mercury can make its way into the human body. First, we can eat fish contaminated with mercury. Secondly, we can inhale vaporized mercury in the air. One example of the effect of mercury on human health is Minamata disease. In 1956, a mysterious illness popped up in Minamata, Japan. People with Minamata disease experienced numbness, muscle weakness, loss of peripheral vision, insanity, paralysis, and coma. Children were born with birth defects. It wasn't until much later that people discovered that it was caused by mercury in industrial wastewater. Mercury made its way into Minamata Bay and bioaccumulated and biomagnified in fish and shellfish, eventually making its way to human beings. A fish contaminated with mercury is shown here on the left, and a sign from a lake in Wisconsin contaminated with mercury is shown on the right. Make sure you understand that bioaccumulation refers to the accumulation of a toxic chemical in the tissues of one particular organism. And make sure you understand that biomagnification refers to the increased concentration of a toxic chemical the higher an animal is on a food chain. Bioaccumulation occurs on the scale of one organism. Biomagnification occurs on the scale of an entire food chain. In section 17.1, we're going to look at the major health hazards we face. One of the first things we try to do when we evaluate human health hazards is to measure risk. Risk is the probability of suffering harm from a hazard, and it's normally expressed as a ratio or percentage. For example, according to this infographic, your chance of dying because of a motor vehicle is 1 in 77, and your chance of dying because of heart disease is 1 in 4. Risk assessment refers to using statistical methods to estimate harm. Basically, risk assessment is determining how risky something is. Risk management refers to deciding whether and how to reduce a particular risk. For example, if we are at risk of suffering harm from a wildfire, the goal of risk management would be to come in and figure out how to minimize that harm. The goals of risk assessment and risk management are different, and as a result, they ask different questions about risk. There are many different types of hazards that we can encounter in our environment. There are biological hazards. These are agents of disease, also called pathogens, that can cause infection and illness. There are chemical hazards that are chemical in nature. There are natural hazards. These are things like fire, earthquakes, volcanoes, and flood that can cause death and destruction. On the bottom left are 3 commonly used symbols for hazards. The first one being for radioactive hazards, the second one being for biohazards, and the third one being for poisons. There are also cultural hazards. These are hazards associated with the way a society is structured or the way in which it is run. These include things like unsafe working conditions and poverty that can affect human health. One specific example is the spread of COVID-19 in meat processing plants across the United States. Finally, there are hazards associated with lifestyle choices. These are created by individual decisions that affect the individuals that make them. They include things like smoking, drinking too much alcohol, and driving recklessly. A photo of a meat processing plant is shown here on the left, and a photo of a person making questionable lifestyle choices is shown here on the right. In section 17.2, we're going to look at the types of biological hazards we face. Biological hazards cause disease, and some diseases can spread from one person to another. Infectious diseases are diseases that are caused by pathogens that invade the body and multiply. Viruses, bacteria, and parasites are all agents of infectious disease. Transmissible diseases are diseases that can spread. We also use the terms contagious and communicable. Infectious diseases tend to be transmissible and are transmitted between people. The photo on the slide shows respiratory droplets that are released when a person coughs or sneezes. These respiratory droplets can carry the pathogens that cause and spread disease. The photo in the upper left shows how hands can carry and spread pathogens. The photo on the bottom left shows a guinea worm, a parasite that can invade and infect the human body. There are other diseases that cannot be spread from one person to another. We call them non-transmissible diseases, and they're usually not caused by living organisms. They include things like heart disease, most cancers, and diabetes. When we have a large-scale outbreak of an infectious disease, we call that an epidemic. When the epidemic goes global, we call it a pandemic. This infographic shows all the different pathways in which a pathogen can make its way into a human being. This graph uses data from 2010 and 2012 to show the global death toll of different infectious diseases. An example of a disease that is both infectious and transmissible is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis is caused by bacteria that infect the body and cause the growth of nodules in the lungs. If left untreated, it can also cause death and is associated with 1.4 million deaths around the world, primarily in less developed countries. Unfortunately, the number of tuberculosis infections is on the rise, and this is due to a number of reasons. First, there isn't enough screening and aren't enough control programs. Secondly, the bacterium that causes tuberculosis is becoming more and more resistant to antibiotics. And finally, people who are suffering from AIDS are much more susceptible to TB. This photograph shows how X-rays can be used to diagnose tuberculosis. This map shows the incidence of tuberculosis around the world. It also shows how less developed countries tend to be more susceptible to tuberculosis. Viral diseases and parasites also kill large numbers of people. The influenza or flu virus is the virus that kills the most people worldwide. HIV is the virus that causes AIDS, and HIV infects 2.5 million people yearly. Viral hepatitis is a liver disease, and the hepatitis B virus, or HBV, causes a transmissible form of it. There are also emergent or new diseases that worry us. These are diseases caused by viruses like the West Nile virus, Ebola, and COVID-19. Viruses that infect one type of organism can quickly evolve and infect another type of organism. Good examples of this are the swine flu that came from pigs and the West Nile virus that came from infected birds. Ecological medicine is a new field of study in which people are trying to understand how viruses jump from one species to another. This diagram shows how different viruses that infect human beings have jumped from other species to us. It includes organisms like birds, bats, and other mammals. As I mentioned before, HIV, or the human immunodeficiency virus, is the virus that causes the disease called AIDS, which stands for Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. People with AIDS are more susceptible to secondary infections by other pathogens because their immune systems are depressed. Unfortunately, there's technically no vaccine to prevent or cure AIDS. Fortunately, there are expensive drugs that can prevent the transmission of HIV and can allow people with AIDS to live normal, longer lives. Between 1981 and 2012, HIV and AIDS have killed about 30 million people. Currently, they kill about 1.7 million people a year. HIV and AIDS are most widespread in sub-Saharan Africa, where it's caused the life expectancy to drop from 62 to 47. With all of the death, it's altered the age structure of the populations in this region. This map shows the prevalence of adult HIV infection around the world. It also shows how Africa leads in prevalence. Botswana is a country in sub-Saharan Africa, and its age structure diagram shown on the bottom left shows how its population has been altered by deaths due to HIV and AIDS. Malaria is a disease caused by a parasite carried by certain species of mosquitoes. It's common in tropical and subtropical regions. Malaria spreads when a mosquito bites an infected person and carries the parasite in its saliva to an uninfected person. Because of climate change and global warming, we expect these mosquitoes and the malaria they carry to spread. Malaria has been on the rise since 1970. This is due to a number of factors. First, the parasite that causes malaria, called Plasmodium, has become more and more resistant to anti-parasitic drugs. Secondly, the mosquitoes that carry the parasite are becoming more and more resistant to insecticides. Third, clearing of tropical forests and developing of that land is exposing more and more people to the mosquitoes that carry the parasite. And finally, people who are suffering from AIDS are particularly vulnerable and susceptible to malaria. This map shows the different areas of the world where malaria is prevalent in red. This photo shows that there are low-cost ways of preventing the spread of malaria, such as mosquito nets. There's good news and there's bad news when it comes to infectious disease. The good news is that deaths resulting from infectious disease have dropped from 35% to 15% within the last several decades. Vaccinations are on the rise, and oral rehydration therapy has proven to be a successful treatment for many of these infectious diseases. The bad news is that more money is needed for research in developing countries. This table offers several solutions in which we can treat and prevent infectious disease.